Right, hello. So we're going to solder the micro SD card slot, which is the only surface mount component on the sensor array. Ignore the tinned pads here. This is take two. The camera didn't record the last time I did it, so I'm redoing it on the same board. Makes no difference though. So what we're going to do is we're going to seat the SD card in position, which will drop into the two little holes here. With the two little plastic pins there, and we're going to focus on the outside ground pins first to make sure that the SD card slot is in the right position before we tackle the tiny little pins here. So what we do is make sure that our soldering iron is nice and tinned and nice and shiny. Yeah, I've left mine a little bit so it's not super shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some solder on it. I'm using 0.3mm solder, which is a lot easier for these surface mount stuff, and I'm using a very fine point, the finest one I've got. So I just tin it a bit and scrape it off on the on your cleaner, whether it be a sponge or the copper braid stuff. Nice, a bit more solder and then wipe it off. We don't want any excess solder on there, but we do want it to be shiny. So right, so what we're going to do is we're going to make sure the pins are somewhat aligned to the pads along here, and then we're gonna solder one of the outside pads. As you can see, it just moved around, so it's okay. We haven't got all the four pads soldered, so we can move it and put it in position while heating this one pad. Now it's pretty much in position. It does have a wiggle on it, so we're gonna move around and solder the opposite corner by touching the iron to the pad and adding a touch of solder to it. If you had very fat solder, you're going to be adding lots of solder at a time, and it, especially with these tiny pins here, that can get out of hand. Right, so just checking now to see if we are still aligned. So I can heat that one up, push it down a bit, heat that one up. There we go, and our pads are aligned here. So that's not going anywhere, but while we're here we can solder the other outside pads. Make sure my solder's bent the right way. One on the rear, and the last one here. Okay, so now on to the pads, and we're going to switch to the microscope so you can see that more clearly. You don't need the microscope to do them, but a magnifying lens like I've got here, which is articulated and attached to my desk, is really useful. Right. So here we have a close-up of the pins and the pads on the micro SD card. Make sure that your soldering iron is nice and tinned, looking nice and shiny, else you will have some problems. So I'm adding some solder as usual, wiping it, adding more solder, wiping it until I've got a nice shiny surface. So with the small thin soldering iron tip, we can apply some pressure to where the pin and the pad meet. This mitigates some of the shake from your hand, it keeps it held in place, and then we can apply some solder. So at some points I'm applying solder to the underside of the soldering iron and then trying to transfer that over to the pin and the pads. Sometimes that doesn't work so well, so I apply pressure and heat to the pin and the pad, and then I come in with the solder to wick that onto the joint. As you can see here, the solder doesn't want to attach itself to the soldering tip, and that's a good indication that you need to wipe the soldering tip and make sure it's nice and shiny. I'm going back to putting some solder on the underside of the soldering tip, not too much obviously. If you've got a huge blob of solder on your soldering tip, then you're likely to bridge two of the connections. Just being careful, slow and steady, and there you go. So they're not looking that neat, so what I'll do now is I'll come out around my soldering iron only, and I'll reflow all those joints to make them look neat and shiny. Now if you get a solder bridge, which I'll create on purpose here just to demonstrate how to get rid of it, it's not a problem. All you need to do is, with a shiny soldering iron again, drag that through the middle of it, and you should part that bridge. Now we want to clean the area with some isopropanol to get rid of the flux residue that you can see there that's all shiny. That'll dissolve all the residue and clean it up nicely. I'm using an old toothbrush for this. And then we can test for any continuity between pins, any solder bridges that we might not be able to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to test whether the pin and its neighbor are connected. It's easier to see that they're not connected under the microscope, but it might not be easier to see if you're not using a microscope. So the other thing is the pins, we could have potentially connected the pins to the chassis of the card slot, so we'll test those as well. So using the multimeter in continuity mode, we test each pin and its neighbor to see if we get a beep. If we don't, we're all good. And then we'll test between the chassis and the pins themselves. That pin there is connected to ground, so we will get a beep there, and that's fine. The rest we shouldn't. So congratulations, you've just soldered the micro SD card slot onto your sensor array, and that should work perfectly now.